We're here at BK Live with former New York can I start over again since this is pre-taped? Okay, thanks.
5, 4.
We're here at BK Live with former NYPD Commissioner Bernard Kerik, and for the moment, anyway, BK Live will stand for Bernard Kerik Live, and so we're just going to go ahead and get started. How are you, former Commissioner?
I'm good.
Good. So we're here to talk about your new book. You've now moved from being a former Commissioner of Corrections, former Commissioner of NYPD, former candidate for the Department of Homeland Security top post, a former federal inmate, and now prison reform activist. Tell me a little bit about what you think is wrong with the current prison system that we have today.
I've been in criminal justice my whole career, since I was 18. And I've worked in just about every position you could imagine. I've been a cop, a correctional officer, a federal drug agent, a warden. I was commissioner of Rikers, had Rikers for 6 years, took it from one of the most violent jail systems in the nation to an international model for efficiency and accountability and safety. And then I became New York City's police commissioner. I was pretty convinced I knew the criminal justice system until I actually went to federal prison. And I've put a lot of people in prison, but they were bad people that did really bad things. People that tried to kill me, people that killed men I worked with, people that I seized tons of cocaine from and millions in drug proceeds. And then I got to federal prison, and I met young black men out of Baltimore and Harlem. Conspiracy and 5 grams of cocaine, 10 years, 15 years, sentences. I met commercial fishermen that caught too many fish. I met young men that they enhanced their income on a mortgage application to buy their first home, federal prison. A guy that sells a whale's tooth on eBay. And I came to realize quickly there's 2 things happening in the country. One, we're taking young, nonviolent, first-time drug offenders, we're putting them away for so long that we do nothing but institutionalize them. We suck all the societal values out of them. We teach them how to be real thugs, real criminals, and then we send them back into society with no life improvement skills, no education, no programs, no vocational skills, and then we wonder why the recidivism rate isn't dropping. On the second half, on the white-collar half, we're taking people, we're locking them up for regulatory and civil issues. We take them out of the workforce, and we are losing tens of billions of dollars each year, the American taxpayer, over the reported cost of incarceration. And I think from an outside perspective, as a criminal justice expert, as an executive of a law enforcement agency, these are things you don't see and understand unless you've been on the inside. And unfortunately, or fortunately, however you want to look at it, no one with my background or experience, or more so my success in this field, has ever been inside.
Now, I want to touch on something you mentioned earlier on with regard to Rikers Island. You noted that Rikers has now become this model, this international model of efficiency.
No, not now.
Under
not
your
now. Under
reign?
my watch, when I took over in 1994, 95, we averaged 150 stabbings and slashings per month. The overtime rate was double what it was supposed to be. Staff assaults were astronomical.
So then if you cleaned it up, because you note in your book that you cleaned up Rikers, in fact,
Right.
You say that you painted over graffiti, for example, fixed light fixtures, though that for many individuals, even just the most layman observer, wouldn't characterize that as cleaning up Rikers.
Well,
and in
let me ask
fact,
you this.
Rikers has been the subject of federal investigation, granted not under your reign, but still under federal investigation, threatened federal lawsuit for the deplorable conditions at Rikers. So if under your reign in the 90s, Rikers was cleaned up, as you say, what changed that caused it to decline so rapidly, so quickly?
Here's what happened. Well, first of all, it's not rapid, it's 15 years. In 15 years. When I left in 2001, to become police commissioner, we averaged 1 or 2 stabbings and slashings per month. Staff assaults down by 60%, 50%. We improved the medical rate to get the inmates medical attention. It went from 6 hours to get medical attention to 45 minutes.
So you've had some definite successes, it seems, at least looking at the paperwork on it, with regard to the prison system. However, there are still problems with the prison system, still areas of reform. But you note in your book that it took you going to federal prison, being an inmate and experiencing what inmates have to go through while they're incarcerated to realize, wait a second, there's some things wrong with the system. But did you not notice while you were police commissioner, while you were a warden, while you were commissioner of corrections, that there were areas of reform that needed to be attended to?
No, because here's what happens. You focus on your job. Your job as the Commissioner of Correction, my job was care, custody, and control. My job was to make sure the inmates got the services they need when they needed them. By all accounts, and I'm not just the one saying it, the New York Times looked at it, 60 Minutes looked at it, the New York City Department of Investigation looked at it, everybody looked at it, including the ACA, which accredits jails and prisons around the country, and they all agreed that it was unparalleled successes in jail and prison management. But that's not, and keep in mind, I had a jail system. My average length of stay at Rikers was 45 to 54 days. It's not a prison system. So there's no you're not doing rehabilitation at Rikers. Nobody's getting that kind of service. The reality is those people are there pre-trial. They have to be made safe. You got to make sure they're not getting brutally beat, stabbed, slashed, killed, and some of the other scandals that's happened over the last 10, 15 years. In a prison system, it's very different, number one. And number two, I'm not just advocating for prison reform. I'm talking criminal justice reform.
What was the aha moment for you? Or was this a slow burn, slow process to realize that there are things wrong here?
It wasn't slow. It was, I'd say within the first week that I was in the system. I taught a life lessons class to the inmates on the compound. And I remember, talking to some of these guys when I first got there and asking them what they were in for. Like I said, I put a lot of people in prison, really bad people. And then I hear, some kid, 19, 20 years old, tells me, I got 10 years, or I got 15 years. For what? Conspiracy. Conspiracy? Well, all right, what did you have? I had 5 grams of cocaine. You know what 5 grams is? It's like 2 sugar packs, 3 sugar packs in a Dunkin' Donuts shop.
So if you were arresting that individual for having these 2 sugar packs of cocaine, would you then in that moment been shocked that this person would have gotten 10 years? Or did you only become shocked once you actually were able to interact with that person?
No, keep in mind, in New York State, that charge would have been 60 days. It would have been a misdemeanor. It would have been, unless it was an increased violation, unless he was a repetitor, there's nowhere close to that kind of sentence.
Even under the Rockefeller drug laws?
It doesn't, no, still, no, absolutely not. But in the federal system, and this is one of the problems, it's the mandatory minimums and sentencing guidelines. You have a kid in Utah sentenced to 55 years for selling marijuana. 55 years? Selling marijuana, we're now legalizing marijuana in the adjoining states to Utah. The mandatory minimums and sentencing guidelines have got to be repealed, revamped, or eliminated. And I'm not the only one saying that. You have attorneys general saying it. You've got the Republican attorneys general. You have Thornburg and Ed Meese. But
you're coming from a much curious and different position than these individuals that you're noting, because these individuals are saying that, but that there's areas of reform that need to be made. However, they're saying that while they're in positions of law enforcement, while they're sitting at that top post, and you weren't saying that then. You weren't saying that when you.
No.
But you weren't saying that when you were police commissioner. You weren't saying
but you're
this.
Wrong.
I am?
Yeah.
Okay.
Ed Meese has been retired. Ed Meese started the mandatory minimums and sentencing guidelines. Thornburg worked for Rockefeller. These are the guys that started all these mandatory minimums and sentencing guidelines.
And saw the errors of their ways, which is what you're saying that you're seeing.
30 years later, they're saying, well, maybe we were wrong. The reality is, I've been inside. I know you're wrong. And for the conservatives out there, and there are many, that believe, lock them up and throw away the key. Take these kids arrested on a drug charge, and they get what they deserve. When I have conversations with these guys today, I ask them, is that really your position? Do you really understand? Do you know what that means? Because the reality is, you take a kid, 19 years old, you lock him up, you give him 10, he's doing 8.5. Mm-hmm. You're gonna basically teach him how to steal, lie, cheat, manipulate, con, gamble. And most importantly, he's gonna learn while he's in prison that any verbal altercation ends in a beatdown.
What was your response to criminal justice advocates at the time that you were leading and implementing a number of these policies that you now say need to be looked at again? For example, broken windows. For example,
you keep saying this,
stop
but
and
I
frisk.
didn't implement any of these policies.
Enforce.
Okay.
That's a better word. Enforcing these policies. So there were definitely criminal justice advocates that were saying the very same things that you're saying now. When you heard that at that time, what were your thought processes then? That these were not valid concerns, or these weren't valid issues, or was it that your tunnel vision and your focus was mostly on the corrections portions of it? I just really would like to understand, because these are definitely musings that have come out before.
We're talking about two different systems.
Okay.
The state and the city system is very different. Don't confuse it with the federal system.
Well, maybe we're talking about two different systems with regard to prison, federal prison versus state prison. However, the ultimate result is still the same. You're still having individuals who are put behind bars at a high rate for nonviolent drug offenses, whether it's federal prison, whether it's state prison, whether it's under mandatory minimums from a federal sentencing guideline perspective, or whether it's under broken windows policies, for example. So the end result is still the same. The issues are still the same.
No, I know you keep saying that. The end result's not the same.
Is the end result not having an overpopulation of prisons for individuals who are there for for crimes that they probably shouldn't be there for?
The end result is not the same. You keep saying that. It's not the same. Mm-hmm. In a state and city system, they're not getting 8 to 10, 15 years. They're just not. They're not. They're getting 60 days. Maybe they get a year, maybe. If they get over a year, they're not staying at Rikers. They have to leave. The length of stay at Rikers was 45 to 50 days. That's what I controlled. I didn't control a state prison. I controlled the state detention facility.
Right, and then not talking necessarily about things that you had in your control, but just with regard to the policies and the issues that were being brought up as concerns. So these concerns have been around for some time. These aren't new concerns. So whether or not it's that you weren't the one responsible for creating these policies and that sort of thing, these are still criminal justice advocates that are coming out and saying, wait a second, we're seeing some problems here. And your response then was silent with regard to, well, maybe these are some reforms that we should look at. And I do think, and I commend you for coming out now and saying, you know what, I'm looking back and I'm seeing from a firsthand perspective what some of these issues are. And I want to talk now more about what these new policy changes you think are necessary to affect this prison reform efforts that you think are necessary. So in your book, you noted, for example, mandatory minimums. We have to look and readdress that. Sentencing guidelines. Give me some other policy issues that you think are necessary to affect the change that you think need to get done.
There's 4 things that need to happen, I think. First and foremost, the mandatory minimums and sentencing guidelines. They have to be reduced, repealed, or eliminated. Give the judges the authority to judge. You take that kid that has 55 years, that judge in that sentencing, during sentencing, he said himself it was draconian. He said it was unjust, shouldn't be happening. So that has to happen. You need real programs and life improvement skills for these young kids in prison. Chess, checkers, quilting, those were adult continuing education classes where I was. I can assure you that does nothing for recidivism.
Is that why you call prison for some offenders to be a colossal waste of time?
It's a wasteland. That's what it is. It's the warehousing of human beings, especially in a minimum security camp where everybody there is nonviolent. You cannot be there if you have any violence in your background. So you take, whether it's the white collar guys that's some commercial fishermen have caught too many fish, where it's that young first-time nonviolent drug offender. Either way, either one of those, it's a waste of time. They would be better served, especially that young kid. He'd be better served with a drug court where they teach him something, where they teach him respect and discipline, and that parenting goes beyond conception, and that he gets an education, he gets a GED, and if he completes the program, then diminish his record. Because that's more than anything else I'm talking about in reform, that's one of the biggest issues. At what point do you do your time? At what point do you pay your debt to society? At what point are you remade whole as an American citizen? Because as it stands today, you're never made whole. Never, ever. If you violate, you make a mistake at 19, if you live to be 120, you're still a convicted felon, and that cloud lays over on top of you until the day you die.
And you mentioned one thing that you would want to work on is to reinstate a number of the rights that convicted felons lose once they get out of prison. For example, the right to vote, as well as possibly the right to run for office. Are there other rights that you think are necessary to reinstate to a convicted felon to bring them whole, as you just mentioned?
You know what? I think at some point you have to remake them whole, period. Whatever they lost in their conviction, one, as long as they're not a violent felon, and two, if they paid their debt to society, somebody does their time and does their probation, and at some point after that, where they're determined by the court or by probation or someone, there has to be a law that says, okay, they're now going to be a full U.S. citizen again. Because at the rate it goes right now, if you look at last year, the American Bar Association and the National Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers put out a study, a 3-year study. There are 40,000 collateral consequences for a convicted felon nationally through each state in the federal system, 45,000. The premise, you lose your right to vote, you lose your Second Amendment right, you lose your, you can't run for office. That's just a tip of the iceberg. These guys come out, they can't rent an apartment, they can't rent property. Some of them can't get a driver's license. They can't get a job in any field that's regulated by the government. In fact, in some states, you can't be a garbage man if you're a convicted felon. So those things have to be changed.
How do you think we should get through to the policymakers for this? Because we're talking legal changes here. We're talking not just, if someone having an initiative and going forth and trying to get policy work done. These are legal, constitutional to some extent changes that need to be made.
And that's exactly the problem with what we've seen over the last several years. We've got hundreds, if not thousands, of advocacy groups around the country. Some work on rehabilitation and transition back into government and education and vocational skills and all this stuff, and it's God's work and it's great work and it's well intended. The bottom line is they'll be talking that same stuff, looking for money to do that same stuff 30 years from now if the laws don't change. So the bottom line is law has to change, and you've got to push the legislators to do their job, and don't be afraid to do your job, because at the end of the day, that's the problem. The legislators today, many of them, they're scared to death that they're going to look soft on crime if they make these changes, if they even talk about it. Today, Secretary Clinton, Hillary Clinton today, gave a speech in Manhattan, talked about criminal justice reform. She's the first presidential candidate to make a full-out policy statement on what she would do. I don't think she went far enough, but at least it's a start. And I think going into the 2016 elections for president, this has to be one of the top 5 agendas on the next president's plate, whoever it is.
Now, you came up under Republican administrations. Many Republicans, many of those who characterize themselves in the conservative camp, like you said, don't want to seem soft on crime, so therefore they don't really support criminal justice reform efforts, especially not on the legislative angle to it. So how then do you approach individuals that you've worked with in the past to say, hey, listen, this isn't about being soft on crime, this is about making a system that's fair. How does that message get across to more conservative camps?
And it's all about education. And I've dealt with it for the last year and a half. I've been going back and forth to Washington, meeting with every one of them. I've met with everybody in the judiciary and or their counsel over the last year and a half, and even the conservatives. Even the guys, the far right, just lock them up, throw away the key, they get what they deserve, all those arguments. When I'm in a room one-on-one, it's difficult for them to debate me. You have issues. Look, I ran the system. I ran two of the biggest systems in this country, and I did it really well. I've been inside. I know both sides. So you tell me why you think it's good, and I'll tell you whether it's good, and if it's not good, I'll tell you why it's not good. And I'll tell you, I've had a lot of success. The problem is, once we're out of that office, for them to say it publicly, 2 weeks, a month ago, there was a conference, a major conference in Washington, D.C., sponsored by Newt Gingrich and Van Jones. Two ends of the spectrum, the right and left coming together. It was a bipartisan conference. There were a number of Democratic senators and congressmen there, and there were a number of Republican supporters. They showed up on video. And if you go back and listen to my speech, when I spoke, I asked, where are they? Why aren't they in this room? Why aren't they watching that video about that kid that got 55 years for selling marijuana? I want to see your face. I want you to watch that video and tell me that that's okay.
Are there any GOP candidates right now in the field of 2016 presidential election that you think would be more receptive to this line of argumentation, for this line to push for criminal justice reform? Rand Paul, for example.
Rand Paul, for sure. I mean, I've sat with him privately, personally. I've talked to his staff. Rand Paul doesn't need staff to talk about this. Rand Paul knows it. He understands it. He believes it. And I've had personal conversations with him. There's some others out there that have different elements of the criminal justice system they'd like to see changed. Not as much as I'd like, though.
How do you respond to critics who've read your book, who've written on your book, and have been extremely critical in saying that this is just a mere publicity stunt? This is an attempt by Kerik to clean up his public image. There have been a number of critics who have come out, and
Listen,
how do you respond to that?
I could care less. You want to criticize, fine. You can't take away my success in what I've done, and I've been there. So you can listen to me, not listen to me. It doesn't make any difference to me. There needs to be change. And at the end of the day, if there's not change, this is an economic catastrophe for this country. It's an economic catastrophe for society. Now,
wrongful convictions has been something, in Brooklyn in particular, that has come to the forefront. We've had at least 11 wrongful convictions revealed and overturned in the past year and a half at the very least. You've also noted that you felt that your prosecution was the result of a political witch hunt, overzealous prosecutors. Do you think you were wrongfully convicted?
You know what? I don't want to make this about me. The bottom line is, in my case, there is no doubt in my mind that nothing I was charged with couldn't have been handled civilly or ethically. In fact, it started as an ethics violation for which I paid a $221,000 fine. I think I paid. Bottom line is the federal government came in, chose to take it criminally. I think that's a part of the overall problem, which I mentioned earlier. We're charging people with ethics violations criminally. We're taking people for regulatory violations, charging them criminally. Civil violations, doing the same thing. Bottom line is, let's not make it about me. Let's make it about the system. Wrongful convictions, and here's something I think I wrote about in the book, but I've said this a couple times, and people, you have to think about it when I say it. We have congressional hearings when some federal agent has sex in a foreign country. We have congressional hearings to tell us how well the Nielsen rating systems accounts for our television watching. We've had 1,500 to 2,000 people in the last 10, 15 years wrongfully convicted in courts in this country, sentenced to tens of thousands of years in prison. Yet we don't have congressional hearings on that.
Well, maybe that's definitely something that sounds you should be championing.
There's no greater threat to a democratic nation like ours than a government that doesn't protect its citizens' freedoms and liberties as aggressively as it pursues justice. There's a problem with that. And I think that's a clear demonstration. So if the Congress and Senator Grassley in his new position as Judiciary Chair, he wants to focus on something, that's what he should be focused on.
Now, talking about the system, talking about policies, and policies that are still being implemented today in New York, broken windows, looking back now, do you think that broken windows, that policy of having summons for very minor offenses, in the goal of making sure that at least small crimes are taken away, that way we clear the path and make sure or try to make sure that larger crimes aren't taking place, is that worth readdressing? Is that worth saying we should probably remove broken windows and focus on a different type of policy to stop over-policing, for example, more minority communities here in Brooklyn and throughout New York City?
Well, I don't think broken windows is over-policing. Keep in mind, those very communities that you're talking about, I worked here in Brooklyn. I was in this 8-4, 7-9, 7-7.
Your first arrest was on Flatbush and
It was
Fulton,
right here, right around the corner, a couple blocks from here. They sustained an 80% reduction in violence, an 85% reduction in homicides.
And broken windows is...
That was the beginning. That was the beginning. And who championed it? Bill Bratton, Jack Maple. The very guy that's in there today created it. And that's where you saw these major drops in crime. And those programs continued. The problem is, it's just like stop and frisk. Nobody wants stop and frisk. We've seen substantial increases in shootings now. I foresee hot summer, you're going to see a lot more shootings without stop and frisk.
Now, many people say that the reason why we no longer need broken windows was implemented during a heyday of crime, a crime wave in the city. We don't necessarily have that anymore.
But
so
back?
These policies, but broken windows policy, the implementation of it, and the enforcement of it really seems to have gotten more play as Bratton has become police commissioner. So, I'm wondering, and these are things that critics have said, is that we're not in that era anymore. And so therefore those policies that define that era are no longer policies that should be implemented or are effective today.
I'll give you a good example.
Yeah.
The way we started out, Rikers. The policies at Rikers worked. When I left, they changed all the policies. What happened? It's at all-time high violence. And keep in mind, the one thing I didn't say earlier, they have 10 to 12,000 less prisoners than I did. Their violence is out of control, scandals out of control, corruption out of control. It's about accountability in those programs.
How then can we, hold the system accountable, for example? Go for it.
That's the answer.
Okay.
Accountability.
Yeah.
First line supervisors. There has to be accountability. Under my time at Rikers, the inmates were held accountable for their actions. You can't hold a kid down on the ground, take a chicken bone, and carve 180 stitches into another kid's back and not be held accountable for that. And that's what was going on before I got there. No different for the staff. You can't beat down inmates for no reason. You can't assault people. You can't torment people for no reason. They were held accountable on both sides. It changed the system. In the streets today, first line supervisors, training, accountability, that's what manages the system and makes it right. And I think that's where we may be lacking.
And quickly to touch on issues that are, like I really want to get to some of what's going on currently. We've got Baltimore, we've had Eric Garner, we've had a number of unarmed men of color being killed or brutalized by police officers. How would you respond if you were in Bratton's position to the police brutality rates, or at least the awareness of police brutality that's being seen now thanks to bystander video, body cameras, and things of that nature? How did you react to that?
I think, I think to be fair, you have to take each one of these incidents separately. Don't take one look at it and broad brush the entire police department or an entire community. It doesn't make any difference. It shouldn't be. I've spoken out about Ferguson and Staten Island in this issue, the Baltimore issue. I have to tell you, I've listened to some of the stuff said. I don't think that kid had a problem in the van, based on what I've seen. That kid had a problem before he ever got in the van. He was in distress by that video, by the video I saw. He was in distress when those cops picked him up. Why they picked him up, why they put him in the van, I have no concern. I don't know.
We're still waiting to hear the report. It's been a number of days and we
it's
haven't
been a number of
gotten
days,
anything.
and I'll tell you, the unfortunate thing that we do, that happens in these communities, the communities, you know, there's this unrest and there's focused on unrest, and we lose sight of the real issue. The real issue is, why is Freddie Gray dead? What happened to him? Who did what, or what didn't they do? And I think, I have to say, the cops that were with him on the ground, why didn't they call the medical services? Yeah. Why didn't they have him treated? I don't know.
Yeah, questions that we hope to be answered soon. And my last question, you've been on the outside, you've been on the inside. What would be your advice to an individual who is approaching a prison sentence as they get ready to go into prison, in a minimal security prison, something along the lines for a white-collar crime that you went to jail for? What would be your advice to that individual? And then what would be your advice to prison authorities? Just if you give them one sort of tidbit of information, having been an inmate, that you would have wished you would have known when you were a top cop.
To give them, to give the authorities something, and I talk about this a lot because when I ran Rikers or the PD, this was one of my sort of pet peeves, but I'm really on it now because I watched it close up. You're deprived of your freedom when you're sent to prison. That's your punishment. The judge says you're going to lose your freedom, they send you to prison. Some correction officers, they believe it's their job to punish you. They demean you, they demoralize you, they degrade you, and it's inappropriate, it's against policy, in some cases it's against the law. That's not their job. And if there's anything that can be done to change that, and it's all about training and first-line supervision, that's really important, because you break people's mental psyche by doing this. You break men to be nothing. It's horrifying to watch and to see the end result, and especially for the young kids. Somebody going to prison, prison is like dying with your eyes open. Be prepared for it, because your whole world is going to stop and everything around you is going to go forward. Your kids are going to grow, you're going to have deaths in your family, you're going to have weddings. All you can do is watch from afar and do nothing.
Wow. Well, thank you so much, Bernard Kerik, for coming down
Thank
to
you.
BK Live to talk to us about this. And we look forward to following your progress on criminal justice reform and prison reform. So thank you again.
Thank you.
Yep.